This is your instructor for English 101, Professor Crow, and so we are now social distancing, and but I still wanted to go ahead and give you my presentation for compare and contrast. This is our next rhetorical style that we're going through in our class. So I wanted to be sure that you got this information. You can also find this information in the Brightspace. This PowerPoint is uploaded there, so you can refer back to the slides without having to listen to the recording, but I thought I'd record it. Also, just so that you guys had something similar to what you're used to in class. So without further ado, I'm going to go through the compare and contrast rhetorical style. Okay, so what is compare and contrast? So when you compare two things, or two or more things, you're looking at the ways they are similar. When you contrast, you're looking at how they are different. And we use this as a way to understand the world around us. So we're looking at information and we're taking it in, and one way to analyze that information is to look at the ways that things are similar and to look at the ways that things are different. And that's how we begin to better understand information. So we do this all the time. This should not be unfamiliar to you guys. You're probably doing it constantly, actually, like looking at ways things are the same, things are different, and that's how we, process information. So this isn't new, but looking at the structure and how you structure that into paper might be. So when to use compare and contrast. So for this class, I'm going to ask you specifically when to use compare and contrast forms. But for other classes, you might not be asked that, but it is a choice you can make. Some of the key words that you might see to help you indicate whether you would use a compare and contrast form is if you see the words compare and contrast. That's a pretty easy one. Similarities and differences, relative merit. So those are things that you're looking at similar things. Advantages and disadvantages is a way, or something's greater, meaning you're looking at things a way they're different because one's better than the other or bigger than the other. So feel free to use compare and contrast forms, especially in this class for the exit essay. If that seems appropriate, feel free to use these compare and contrast forms. I don't write the exit essay. This is given to us by the college. So if you feel that it's warranted to have a compare and contrast form, then by all means, feel free to use these forms that we'll go over in a minute here. So how to use compare and contrast. So you can use them together, where you can look at similarities and differences. You can look at just the similarities, or you can look at just the differences. So it'll just depend on how you're writing your thesis statement and what you want to emphasize in your writing. An analogy is a specific form of comparison where you're looking at two things and seeing and showing them as similar by kind of focusing on the more familiar thing. So for instance, if you want to say, a grocery store is like a war zone right now. So you might say, talk about the grocery store, but you're comparing it to a war zone, and you might give a lot of information about a war zone and then say how the grocery store is just like that. And so that's an analogy, and that's just another way you can look at compare and contrast, because it is a comparison using two things and looking at their similarities. So in order to compare and contrast, you have to establish a basis for comparison. So you have to have enough commonality to justify this comparison. So you might want to think about some less obvious ways to compare two things or contrast two things, or both. But you might not want to just focus on the most obvious, because that could be a fairly boring read if it's so obvious that everybody can see it. But you might want to think about ways that things compare or contrast on a deeper level, or so a less obvious level. So you're really like using your brain and really looking at how you can look at these things and make claims about them that are similar in ways that maybe are unusual or different. So how do you determine the points of comparison? So to determine these points, first decide if you're going to look at ways to compare, contrast, or both. And then you can look at the points that you're going to relate to your argument. So for our main essay is to determine how two main groups in which we belong influence our lives. So when you're looking at these groups, determine your basis of comparison as things that define you or help you make decisions. So those are how you're going to determine those points of comparison. So it can be anything you want, but you need to think about that in your brainstorming process or your pre-writing process. Make sure you're looking at these bases of comparison, figuring out what you want to focus on. So I was going to do a little exercise in class, so we're going to look at how how you would determine the points of comparison between a few things. So apples and oranges. So some of the obvious things that you might not want to do because they are so obvious is they're both fruit. They're both food. They're both colorful, something like that. But that you might want to look at, they're both nutritious. They're both grown on trees. Maybe you want to compare the elements that they're grown in. So oranges are grown in, the south or the west in more warmer temperatures, where apples are, more in the north. So those are things that you can look at that might be less obvious than just they're both food or something. City and suburbs. So, you could look at, population densities, amenities, public transportation, different things like that might be less obvious than just, one's in the city and one's just outside of the city, or, they're both more populous than rural or something like that. That's a little less interesting. Pizza and Chinese food. So, the more obvious would be that they're both food or they're both delicious. But you might want to think about, they both offer a large delivery service, or they're both ethnic, or, the differences maybe they're, they use different seasonings and spices to give their food flavor. Something like that might be a way to compare and contrast. So just, dig deeper than just that surface level. Try and think further about how you might compare and contrast some things. So developing a thesis. So you need to have an argument in your thesis, always, always, always. So even though this isn't an argumentative paper, you need to have an argument in it. So you need to tell your readers what they can expect, which means identifying the subjects to be compared and contrasted, but also the point you will make about them. It should state if you're going to focus on similarities, differences, or both, and then the argument or assertion that you're making about these comparisons. So I know you guys like examples, so I went ahead and wrote a thesis example. This is based on the writing prompt that I had given you. So both my family life and my work life help to form my identity because they both support me, challenge me, and allow me to help others. So I'm looking at comparing my family life and my work life, and I'm looking at the similarities because they say both of them do this. So I'm looking at the similarities between them. They both support me, they both challenge me, and they both allow me to help others. So those things are important, or that's what I'm going to be looking at in my paper. So that's the argument I have. Like, these things do this for me. So structuring a compare and contrast essay. There are two ways to structure your compare and contrast essay. It's subject by subject or point by point. So subject by subject is where you look at the one group and then the second group. So you take one group and you look at all the different things, and then you take the second group and look at all the different things. So for instance, in my thesis statement, I would look at subject 1, home life, subject 2, work life. And then I'd look at all the things within that subject. And that's how I'm making my comparisons. Now, just a quick note, you have to have at least 5 paragraphs for your final essay for compare and contrast. So be sure you're looking at how you can structurally work this. What are you going to have a third subject that you're looking at? Are you going to break up somehow into maybe 4 paragraphs? Because you could have 6 paragraphs if you wanted, if you're really looking at the subject by subject. So think about that though, because structure is very important for these academic essays. The next way is point by point, and this is really how I would probably write the paper that I wrote the thesis statement for. So it is, so for this, we have the introduction, and then we have the point 1, which would be supporting me. Okay, they both support me, right? They both challenge me. That would be my point 2. And then they both allow me to help others. So that would be my point 3. So for point 1, I would say how both home life and work life support me. I would say how both home life and work life challenge me. And then I would see how both home life and work life allow me to help others. So that would be probably how I would structure this essay if I were using that thesis statement that I wrote. It fits here. I've got 3 different points, and then I would look at both subjects within each point. But it's your choice how you want to structure it. Those are the 2 ways to structure compare and contrast. And then these are also in your textbook, but these are the transitions for comparing. In comparison, in the same way, just as, so, like, likewise, similarly. And these are the transitions for contrast. Although, but, conversely, despite, even though, however, in contrast, instead, nevertheless, nonetheless, on the contrary, on one hand, on the other hand, still, unlike, whereas, yet. So you can find those transitions in your textbook. You can also find this in your textbook. This is on page 376 to 377. 377 is where you find the edit checklist, but use these, please. They're really, really helpful to go through. After you have all the stuff out on your paper, go through. Does your assignment call for comparison and contrast? It does. What basis for comparison exists between the 2 subjects you're comparing? Okay, so look at these items and say, does your paper do this? Does your essay have a clear thesis? Do you discuss the similar points for both subjects? Have you written a subject by subject, and have you included transitions? Have you written a point by point, and have you included transitions? Have you included transitional words and phrases that indicate whether you're discussing similarities or differences? So really important to go through this and make sure. Also, when you're looking at each of your supporting paragraphs, make sure you have a strong topic sentence that states your claim. Then you put all of your supporting information, and then make sure you have that warrant at the end. It's really important that you have the warrant that's going to tie the supporting information, the supporting details, back to your thesis statement claim, okay? So that you're telling your reader exactly how this information proves your thesis statement argument. So let me know if you have any questions though, and yeah, that's it. So just email me if you guys have questions. Thanks.